A priest in Delaware was being honored after nearly 60 years of service in his parish. A famous politician had been chosen to make the presentation to the priest and give a little speech at the dinner, but he was running late, so the priest made his own little speech first. I got my first impression of this parish from the very first confession I heard here. I thought I had been assigned to a terrible place. The very first person who entered my confessional told me that he had stolen a television set and when questioned by the police had lied his way out of it. He had stolen money from his parents. He had embezzled from his employers. He had had an affair with his boss's wife. He'd taken illegal drugs. I was appalled. As the days went on, however, I learned that my people were not all like that and that I had indeed come to a fine parish full of good and loving people. And just as the priest finished his talk, former Vice President Joe Biden arrived and hugged the priest and put his arms on the shoulders, apologized for being late. And he said, "I'll never forget the first day our parish priest arrived. In fact, I had the honor of being the first person to go to him for confession." My passage this morning comes from the 5th verse of our Old Testament reading, the 3rd chapter of Ecclesiastes. The teacher tells us, "For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven." And in verse 5 he says, "A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing." My sermon title is "The Love We Learn at Arm's Length." The men in my family started kissing each other when I was about 40 years old. We didn't talk about it, we just did it. And I should say that we returned to kissing each other. I always kissed my father when I was little, my older brothers. It came naturally. "I love you. Here's a kiss. Here's a hug." It was the other stuff, the boys don't kiss boys, not even when they're fathers and brothers and sons. That's what was unnatural. So we just let go of that unnatural habit and started kissing each other again. My family heritage is Greek. We're Mediterraneans, just like that man, the Apostle Paul, who urged early Christians to greet one another with a holy kiss. We live and die by affection, we Mediterraneans. We'll hug anyone and everyone. It's like that in other cultures too. Caribbean, Latin, Pacific Islander, African. It was an African who first expressed this kind of affection when he said, "This at last is flesh of my flesh and bone of my bones." What Adam said of Eve in Genesis 2, we could say of any of our precious ones. The sleeping child whose forehead we kiss, the mother in a nursing home whose hair we stroke, the lover at whose touch we thrill, the friend who we hold until the grief subsides, just as they have held us in our own time of mourning and pain, the fellow Christian that we greet with a holy kiss or a peace-filled hug. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to embrace. Of course, it's logical, it's natural, it makes sense. We have this yearning for one another that moves us to close the physical distance that separates us, a time to embrace. Just let me know when, just let me know where, and I'll be there. For a good hug, well, to me, it seems like a family reunion. A time to embrace, the teacher tells us, and I couldn't be more pleased. But then the teacher adds, and a time to refrain from embracing. Refrain from embracing? Refrain from embracing? Well, why in heaven's name? When I was a young student minister serving a small parish in rural Minnesota, a parishioner, Janet, asked me to call on her in her home. She would pick me up at the church, she said, and then drive me there, and then drive me back to the church after the visit. We talked on the way, and when we arrived, she took me for a tour of the rooms in her home, and then suddenly Janet embraced me, and she tried to kiss me. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't exciting. It was terrifying. I firmly separated myself from her. I apologized, and I walked a mile back to the church. 2 days later, Janet met with my supervisor and me. My supervisor told her about the importance of respecting proper boundaries in any relationship, and especially in a church relationship. And she explained to Janet why I couldn't be her pastor anymore, and she had to leave the church. Of course, that was only my story. I know you would have your own to tell, many painful, some terrifying, all of them wishing that other person had understood that there is a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A love that does not respect the other is not love. A love that seeks to dominate the other is not love. If we love the other, it means we don't love what we imagine that person to be. We don't love what we want that person to be. We don't even love what we need that person to be. We just love them, who they are, just as they are. That's why a love that is not able to refrain from embracing is not love. The teacher grasped the fullness of it. We need to learn how to love at arm's length. All of us, men, women, politicians, preachers, teachers, parents. I remember when my oldest child had just graduated from high school. She was about to head off to college, and this is the same daughter that I held in my arms as a baby. This, at last, is flesh of my flesh and bone of my bones. She announced that summer that she was no longer going to church. She didn't believe in God anymore. You know what I wanted to do. I wanted to argue. I wanted to persuade. I wanted to beg her to keep her heart open to God's loving presence wherever she might find it. And I wanted to sweep her up in my arms and press her to me, hoping that my faith would somehow envelop her. But I didn't do any of that. I stood my ground. I held my tongue. I listened. I respected. I trusted. I tried to learn how to love my daughter at the arm's length that she needed. That's what Ecclesiastes, that wise old teacher, is instructing us. But this lesson doesn't just come from this teacher, it comes from the teacher, the greatest teacher there ever was. Mary had wept bitter tears on that gray morning visiting her teacher's tomb, and those of us who are familiar with the Easter story are no longer surprised that it was not the gardener, but Jesus who said, "Mary," and it opened her eyes to the resurrection. But we are still surprised when Mary rushes to the Lord and he says to her, "Do not hold me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father." Do not embrace me. Let me go. I must become what I will become. Even Jesus Christ is not the one we imagine him to be. He is not the one we want him to be. He is not even the one we think we need him to be. He is who he is. The only begotten child of the Father, Mother, God. That's precisely why he can save us. For Mary and for us, it's the ultimate miracle of love, our salvation, and it's a lesson to be learned at arm's length. Yes, he has taught us. Our teacher has taught us Jesus may have broken down the barriers between us, but his love demands that we respect the boundaries of integrity between us, between you and I. Maybe it was from Jesus' teaching that the Apostle Paul was bold to tell those married Corinthians that even in their marriages they should observe a time to refrain from embracing, a practice of a season of celibacy in their marriage. Could Paul be teaching us that it is with those closest to us that we need to learn again, to love again at arm's length? Maybe that's why my spouse tells me to let go of her a second and listen. Listen to what she's saying and talk to her. Tell her what it is I'm thinking and feeling. Use words, she says, and she's right. Through her, through my daughter, through many others, God is trying to teach me a new kind of love, the love that Jesus taught Mary, that Paul taught those Corinthians, one that is learned at arm's length, one that both breaks down barriers and respects boundaries, one that is patient and kind, that is not jealous or boastful, arrogant or rude, a love that does not insist on its own way, that is not irritable or resentful, a love that does not rejoice at wrong but rejoices in the right, a love that believes all things, bears all things, hopes all things, believes all things, endures all things, a love that never ends. That is the love we learn at arm's length, a love for which there is a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. Amen.